Just who were the Romans? Talk number 7 in a planned series of 9. I've entitled this one, Taking Over the World. Remember, the first one was taking over the past, then taking over a hill, taking over a country, taking over a sea. Number 5, being taken over. Number 6, being taken over by somebody else this time, by the generals. And now number 7, taking over the world. This began round about 1st century AD. This, at last, we have reached the Roman Empire that everybody is familiar with. Everybody thinks they know all about this. Partly because our general knowledge has been enhanced, without our knowing it, by the writings of some authors who got themselves pretty well into the nation's bloodstream, sometimes without them even knowing it. You may not have heard of somebody called Paul Lytton, but he wrote a book called The Last Days of Pompeii. And that became, as you well know, familiar to everybody, the destruction of Pompeii by the volcano of Vesuvius. Then you've heard of Ben-Hur, made into 2 massive Hollywood films. You've probably heard of Robert Graves, who wrote a couple of novels all about the Emperor Claudius. That was turned into a massive, equally massive BBC television series twice. So everybody got to know that. They all went to see Quo Vadis in the 1950s. They went to see Ben-Hur in the 1960s. It's the century in which Jesus appeared. So, of course, everybody knows about that. They've all heard of the most famous or the most infamous Roman provincial governor of all, Pontius Pilate. And as I said, they've all heard of the destruction of Pompeii. We are in familiar country. We are at last in cliché country. The thing everybody thinks they know about. Having learnt that, they think that's it. They've done the Roman Empire. Rome is teeming with vulgar crowds, yelling their heads off in arenas. There are plots and murders, decadence and depravity. There are mad emperors who wield absolute power, corrupted by absolute power, and wielding corrupt absolute power. This is the century of the Christians being sent into the arena. This is the century of the chariot races and millions of slaves all over the place. Togas, temples, roads, aqueducts, laws, legions, and Latin. They're all here. So you know where you are. Now, let's apply a little bit of common sense, shall we? Clearly, all those things I mentioned are true, but they didn't all start at the beginning of the 1st century AD. And they didn't all finish at the same time either, and they weren't all equally important right through that period either. But they are important, no doubt about that. Not everybody, of course, was influenced by the, as I said, the decadence or the depravity. Most people, poor soul, didn't have the time or the money or the opportunity or the energy. Most people led ordinary humdrum lives as they had always done and as they always continue to do. But the cliché is very, very powerful. You can't think of the Roman Empire without thinking about all those laws and legions and roads. In the same way, you can't think about King Alfred without thinking of cakes. You can't think about Hannibal without thinking of elephants. And you can't think about Napoleon without thinking about all that snow in the retreat from Moscow. So I've got to tackle, therefore, a period of history. Don't forget, we waited, 700 years to get to this particular stage. I've covered 700 years in 6 talks, which is, impossible, isn't it? And I propose to cover another 500 years in just 3 talks, the ones that are left to me. So that's equally impossible too. All I could do is to point out, shall we say, the big things. Imagine that we are in a great space-time satellite. We can look at the world as if we're halfway to the moon, and therefore pick out the really important things. It is said, I believe, that the only man-made object you can see on Earth from space is the Great Wall of China. I don't know whether that shows my ignorance or my knowledge. It is for you to decide. By the same token, think of it as a time satellite as well. Imagine you're looking at the Roman Empire through an enormous camera lens which is several thousand years wide. You've got to embrace the whole thing. So, of course, you're only going to pick out the really important things. Now, if you look through your space-time satellite wide focus lens, what would you notice? The 1st century AD, pretty choppy by and large. It started, well, with the Civil War, full-scale Civil War, but it culminated in the appearance of emperor who became known in the books as Augustus, and he settled things down and began a long period of peace. And it was his family who continued to rule pretty well most of the 1st century. They were not a very engaging lot, and some, as you well know, were a pretty corrupt lot. Caligula was mad, Claudius was poisoned, Nero was murdered, and it didn't end simply with the murder of Nero. When Nero was killed in 69 AD, he was succeeded by 4 very short-lived emperors, all in the space of 12 months. It is known in the books as the year of the 4 emperors. Never mind about the names, you won't remember them anyway. But they were all generals with provincial armies behind them. Remember what I said about the generals leading their soldiers because the soldiers wanted a pension and money and a farm, and they were prepared to attack Rome. 4 of them, all having a go at the imperial crown. The 4th one, it turned out, proved to be successful. Vespasian. He came from the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and he was successful. He survived for quite a few years. He was quite old when he got the imperial crown, but he was, to say, long in the tooth, pretty shrewd, pretty knowledgeable, pretty solid. He was a good soldier, bags of common sense, and his 2 sons succeeded him as well. It was the year of the rise of the century, of the rise of Christianity. That caused a bit of an upset. It was the century of the Jewish revolt, which was an even bigger upset. It was the year of the notorious eruption of Vesuvius. Well, the only one, obviously. So it was the century of the destruction of Pompeii, plus the usual collection of scandals and murders surrounding and involving the imperial family. 2nd century AD, thank heaven, was a good deal better. If you like, looking at it, as I say, through that space satellite, it was as if the empire had settled down, it sort of got its second wind, and began to show signs of solidity, or permanence, even of merit. And the emperors who were in office during that time were pretty good. Trajan, ex-soldier, knew his job, very competent. It was in the reign of Trajan that the empire reached its greatest ever extent. All the maps show you Rome under the rule of Trajan, and it spreads everywhere. He was succeeded by Hadrian. Now, we've all heard of Hadrian, he of the wall. He was good emperor. Hadrian was succeeded by somebody who doesn't get his name in the books very much, called Antoninus Pius, or Pius. But he was good too. And he, in turn, was succeeded by somebody who many of you might have heard of, Marcus Aurelius, who in his spare time was something of a philosopher. So that went on right up to the year 180. Those 4 are known: Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius or Pius, Marcus. They're known as the 4 good emperors. After that, things began to go down a bit. The man who succeeded Marcus Aurelius, called Commodus, started the rot. He developed a propensity for wanting to appear in the arena as a combatant, believe it or not. So the century didn't end well. It started and ran very well, but it didn't end well. Third century, pretty bad, because by this time, a group had established its strength and its influence. Emperors decided that for the sake of security, many of them had, as I say, a pretty dangerous life. Those 4 emperors all came to a sticky end. So later emperors decided they'd better protect themselves, and the earlier ones had begun it, and these developed it, a personal bodyguard, known as the Praetorian Guard. They were elite, specially favoured regiments of troops, and of course, because they were elite and specially favoured, they lorded it over everybody else, and it slowly began to sink in that as they were in charge of imperial headquarters and the imperial palace and all the rest of it, they had huge influence. And in time, it became quite common, or at any rate not uncommon, for Praetorian Guards, or members of it, or officers in it, or even leaders of it, to take the law into their own hands. And murders of emperors by members of the Praetorian Guard became quite common, sadly. And having murdered one emperor, they elevated another. When he turned out to be inadequate, they murdered him too. In the course of the first 3/4 of that century, the 3rd century, there were 19 emperors, so their average reign was barely 4 years. Not very pleasant or permanent prospect, is it? That was the 3rd century. The late 3rd century, things began to take a turn for the better. We had a new group of emperors coming in from a different area, from where the Romans called Illyria. If you don't know where Illyria is, think of the Adriatic, the north coast of the Adriatic, countries today like Slovenia and Croatia. That was what the Romans called Illyria. And they produced 2 or 3 emperors who turned out to be both competent and successful and unmurdered. And they started to pull the empire round again. The last of them was a man called Diocletian, who ruled for quite a long time. And he was the one who started to think big and to reorganize the entire empire. Not just, tinker with little bits here, little bits there. He tackled the whole lot. And he was the one who took the decision to split the empire in 2. He decided it was far too big a unit to run from one centre. Possibly even travelling made life almost impossible. So the beginnings appear of 2 empires, the empire in the west centred on Rome, and the empire in the east, which came to be centred on a new city, because the one who succeeded the came from Britain, actually. And he was the one who decided that the eastern half of the empire needed a capital. So he built one. Oh, surprise, surprise, what did he call it? Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The PLE comes from the Greek word polis, P-O-L-I-S, which means city, where we get our word politician and politics. So he's famous for that, and above all, he's famous too for deciding that he's going to make Christianity the official religion of the empire. All those gods, all those celebrations of the Pontifex Maximus, all the huge variety of gods, all went out of the window, and Christianity became official. So he created, if you like, a new sort of balance, at any rate for a while. Later on in the 4th century, things started to go awry again, because a new emperor arrived round about 360, 370, called Julian. Julian decided he didn't like Christianity, so he tried to put the clock back and bring back all the old gods. There are a lot of people who said that all the Roman Empire's troubles arose from the fact that they'd gone Christian. Jesus, they said, and the Christians had a lot to answer for. So Julian tried to reverse the process of history. It didn't long survive his death. The final emperor to make a lasting effect on the whole empire came shortly afterwards, a man called Theodosius. Theodosius. He was the operative in the 390s, and he was the last emperor to rule a united empire. And things began to go seriously wrong after that, even more seriously wrong, because in the year 410, two things happened. The situation in the Roman Empire, with all the barbarian tribes, more of them later, trying to break into the empire, necessitated a shortening of the frontier. Sacrifices had to be made. And so Britain was left to fend for itself. Also in the year 410, the leader of a barbarian nation, tribe, nation, whatever you like, called Alaric the Goth, sacked Rome, marched down the peninsula of Italy, and tore Rome apart. Two big events which spell the complete end of the Roman Empire overnight. Of course they didn't. But they are two very, very significant events. And they both happened, as it happened, in the year 410. Now, while all those dramatic events are taking place, what's going on all the time? What is happening behind the lurid headlines? There were economic troubles for the empire. It looked huge, it looked prosperous, it looked rich, and all the rest of it, but there were things wrong. There always are, aren't there? Economists will never tell you that everything is pretty jolly good at the moment. Nobody ever says that. But there was a serious balance of payments problem. You see, as the Romans got stronger and richer and bought more and more goodies and got spoiled by all the goodies and wanted even more, so they started buying them, obviously, from the East particularly. And the economic historian tells that there was a serious imbalance of payments. More money was going out buying these rich goods than there was coming in. So you're getting an imbalance of payments. There were serious price rises all over the empire. Diocletian, amongst other things, tried to introduce laws which established maximum prices. And they suffer the fate of every law which tries to establish maximum prices. They just didn't work. A perennial problem was how to feed all these growing cities. Rome wasn't the only one, obviously. Cities were all over. The Romans were very good at building cities, and they built a great number of them. But the inhabitants all had to be fed. And that presented a problem for local magistrates and city councils, right up to emperors. Rome and all the other cities, sooner or later, followed the usual trend and produced city mobs, which were another headache for magistrates and local authorities. Coming in from the East were not only all these luxury goods, but peculiar religions. Christianity was only one of several that came into the empire. You won't remember all the others, if indeed I know them all. But one that became famous was devoted to the god Mithras, Mithras, Mithras. And there are lots of remains of dedications and buildings to Mithras. He was very popular, apparently, amongst soldiers. Lots of legionary barracks and stations have left behind tributes to Mithras. I think some years ago they were going to build something big in London, dug down into the foundations, and found out pretty well a complete temple devoted to Mithras. What did ordinary people know about these funny religions? Probably not very much, and what they did know was probably inaccurate, because people didn't know, therefore all sorts of rumours circulated about them, and before long all sorts of scandals and whispers were noised about what really went on with these awful happenings with the mystic religions. Everything short of devouring their young at the full moon. People were prepared to believe almost anything. The frontier was suffering, of course, getting bigger. The Romans were getting successful, even more so, conquering more land, but the more they conquered, the longer the frontier got. And the longer the frontier got, the more problems there were about defending it. You needed soldiers, and you needed more and more soldiers. And the great problem was manpower. And the more the Roman citizens enjoyed the fruits of empire and the goodies and the comforts of city life and the public baths and all the rest of it, the less inclined they were to join the army. Understandably, who wanted to sign up for 20 years and be stationed in some god-awful place up on Hadrian's Wall? They didn't want to do it. So the problem arose, and increasingly so, of how to staff the army. Well, they were desperate. What was the army there for? The army was there to keep out the wicked barbarians. Again, more of that later on. So they had to do the only thing that seemed possible, namely to recruit barbarians. There had been contact with barbarian tribes, of course there had. All those frontiers were manned by armies, but it didn't mean to say that nobody ever crossed them. People, businessmen, merchants, sightseers, everybody crossed the frontier regularly. So they got to know the barbarian. Many barbarian tribes came over to the Roman side. Some might have chosen to live here as well. So it was not such a big break, a big jump to start recruiting barbarians. Shelter, training, and as far as the Romans were concerned, most of these barbarians were ideal. They were malleable, they did as they were told, they were pleased to be there, they were great, big, strong, strapping young fellows. And so they increasingly recruited barbarians into the Roman army. As time went on, of course, the numbers got greater, and as time went on, some of these barbarians displayed a knack for the military life, so they got promoted. Before long, you have barbarians being promoted to our equivalent of sergeants and sergeant majors, increasingly higher-ranking officers all the time. In the course of that period as well, despite all the success I mentioned about all the conquests, there was one conquest they never made. They tried, but very dramatically failed when a couple of Roman legions were cut to pieces in the German forest. They never conquered Germany. So it is suggested that the Roman failure to conquer Germany goes a long way to explain the division. Romanized Germany, history might have been quite different, but the difference between the Teutonic races, the Teutonic nationalities, and the Romanic nationalities persisted down the centuries. So, as I said, the end result was this Teutonic versus Gallic divide. The army was still holding them, but I repeat, the barbarian element in the army was showing that increasingly more and more high-ranking officers, until in the end, by the turn of the 4th to the 5th century, it resulted in the fact that the commander-in-chief of the entire Roman army was a barbarian. So there's another big, if you like, step, a big dividing line, a big moment. So there were lots of things going wrong, which we can now see. Hence the historian's favourite comment that every institution contains within itself the seeds of its own decline. Historians are always wise after the event. They can always come along hundreds of years later and say, look, there you are, that's been happening for so long, that's been happening for so long, that's been going on for a long time. The result was inevitable. but evidence could be used to make things look pretty bad. And yet, if it looks as if I painted a dismal picture, remember I've been talking about a period of 300 or 400 years. If it had been constant decadence and disillusion and disruption and decay all that time, the Roman Empire wouldn't have lasted half as long. So other things must be happening as well. And what was happening, put simply, the empire was still working. It still ran. The government was still there. Provincial praetors at the end of their year of office in Rome went off and did their provincial governing job, mostly pretty well. The civil service was in full operation. All those civil servants up and down the country were still there, still operating. Civil engineers were building stuff all over the place. The roads, obviously, the cities everywhere, the temples, and the school, well, the colleges, one or two. There were no universities as we understand them. But education was being developed. Admittedly, a lot of it was private. In fact, the majority of it was private. Nevertheless, it was going on. Roads were being built, aqueducts were being constructed, drains were being dug, sewers were being drilled. Latin, remember, was the universal language. That was going on all the time. Citizenship in Rome was something that was very proudly treasured. Don't forget, we had an organization which stretched from Hadrian's Wall, from Scotland, down to the Persian Gulf, and you could travel anywhere in that area, enormous, and speak Latin, and you would be understood. You could write letters from one end of the empire to the other. They would not only be understood, they would be delivered. Things worked. People could travel in situations, in circumstances of pretty good security. If you were a Roman citizen, if you could say, Kivus, I am a Roman citizen, you enjoyed rights and privileges and a certain level of treatment anywhere, I repeat, from Hadrian's Wall to the Persian Gulf. It was a remarkable achievement, and going alongside all that, of course, culture which thrives and a period of peace, and this went on for the best part of 400 years. The famous Pax Romana. Pax, the Latin word for peace. We get our word Pacific from it, to pacify something, to make it peace. Things worked. As I said before, the empire worked, things worked, travelling worked, hotels worked, city councils worked. If there had been such things as trains in the time of the Roman Empire, they would have run on time. Everything worked. Hardly surprising, then, that the barbarian tribes who've been knocking at the frontier for quite a long time now wanted to get in. They didn't want to destroy the Roman Empire. They wanted to get in. Better. And life looked a great deal better than where they had to put up with their existence in the mist and the mountain and the forest. They wanted to share the goodies as well. So the things I said early on, they indicate signs of decline, yes. But the decline was not complete. Remember, this is only historians' hindsight. The decline was not steady. It was not relentless. It was not universal. Rates varied. The empire was a big place. And what we can now see was happening was not necessarily visible to people who lived at the time. So when the western half of the empire did go, it wasn't the end of all things, because there was that eastern half round which Constantine had built his new city. And there was enough life left in the eastern half to enable it to last for another 800 years.